we're now at the part of our day when we're really focusing on what that collaboration with the Tribeca Film Festival means with Games for Change. And I would like very much to welcome the next panel, which is a conversation between Jamin Warren of Killscreen, Craig Hatkoff, one of the co-founders of the Tribeca Film Festival, and Rabbi Irwin Kula. Welcome them. Thank you.
Hello, how are you doing? We good? I'm just sitting out here in the middle of space. My name is Jamin Warren. I run a video game arts and culture company called Killscreen. We publish a magazine. I host a show for PBS called Game Show. So I'm very interested in the intersection between games, arts, and culture, which is why I am more than delighted to be here with Craig and Irwin. I actually wanted to hear a little bit more about the sort of history of Tribeca, and I understand you have been undergoing some change over the last so many years that you've been doing this.
All right, well, so assuming that not too many people know the beginnings, this morning I was at the breakfast and surprised that we take certain things for granted, but the festival was started, basically we launched the festival about 3 months after we announced we were going to do the festival, after September 11th. And it was really a response to how do you get people back onto the streets of Lower Manhattan. And that
Had you always been a film person?
I've been more of a film consumer, not a film producer. So I'm a movie fan is how you would describe me. But my wife, Jane Rosenthal, and her partner, Bob De Niro, and I it wasn't really my idea to do a film festival, but I was enlisted to help try and figure out how to do one in 90 days. And made no sense, and it worked. So.
Good things happen under constraints.
If I thought about it too much, it probably would have not done it. But what was
the initial mission for Tribeca? Did you guys have like a tagline that you wanted?
It was really. I mean, there was a number of different types of taglines. One was "Have a meal, save a job." How do we get people on the street, start going to the restaurants, back into the stores? But it was really. It was part of a spiritual move from the mourning process to an invitation to start celebrating, but remembering. And Irwin, he'll tell you a little bit about his background.
Well, how did you two connect? And Irwin, I'd love to hear a little bit more about.
How did we connect? We were at a dinner that we were both invited to. I was part of the entertainment at the dinner, kind of the rabbi at the table who's supposed to try to be smart. And
is that for like can you rent a rabbi?
Yeah, well, yes. It's only what the price is, and Craig sits down next to me, and amongst the first things he says to me is that I'm not religious, which is always the most interesting people in the world. I'm not religious, I'm not spiritual, and I don't go to synagogue. I said, okay, that's fantastic. I'm not interested in ever making you go to synagogue. And we wound up having this amazing conversation about science and about Galileo and about the church, and it turns out that Craig is one of the more spiritual people I've ever met. It's just in a completely, absolute secular mask.
Now, one of the things that you guys have talked a lot about, or you've worked on together, is this idea of disruptive innovation, and that's been a part of your work, obviously, with Tribeca, and also with some of your work as well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that concept and how it intersects between what the two of you all currently have been working on.
Okay. For those of you who are familiar with disruptive innovation theory, it's a Harvard Business School professor. We're just going to get just enough to get you through.
2 hours, 2 full hours of disruptive innovation.
But disruptive innovation is Clay Christensen from Harvard Business School developed this kind of paradoxical theory that rather than trying to make perfectly good, powerful products better and better, which is what industry incumbents tend to do, it's usually 2 guys in a garage who come along, make a product that's just good enough to what we call get the job done. And industry after industry, case after case, the 2 guys in the garage decimate the incumbent.
Just a matter of time.
It's just a matter of time. And it had nothing to do with originally, I guess, the first 6 years of our relationship where we were talking about everything other than disruptive innovation until one day Clay Christensen wrote the book. It's kind of like the Silicon Valley Bible, which is called The Innovator's Dilemma. I don't really know what possessed me, but I said, Irwin, read this book. I don't know what it has to do with religion, but I think you'll enjoy it. And
were you in a garage at the time?
We were in an office.
In
We were in an
your-
office.
in your home.
We have our own little sacred space. I'm not very big on going to synagogue or cathedrals other than to see
Or
the art.
offices.
Or offices, for that matter. So I handed him the book, and
I took the book, read it that evening, couldn't put it down. Didn't understand all the business stuff, but I understood for the first time what it is that I do. And, you know, a book that reveals who you are is a pretty serious book, and that is, you know, not to make more of it than it is, a disruptive spiritual innovator or a disruptive religious innovator. And that actually, looking at religion was simply not getting the job done. And I think increasingly we know that in the West it's not getting the job done, and in a lot of other places it isn't either, but more and more people are what we call nones, N-O-N-E-S. And that's the fastest growing demographic in America. And that's people who are no longer identifying with any kind of official religion, but it doesn't mean that they don't have all the jobs that religion is supposed to get done needed. And so what we really need is tremendous innovation inside of religion. And I began to think about it. I called him the next day. I came over to his house and I said, oh my God, we need disruptive religious innovation and we need it quickly.
So at this point, you know, larger religions are starting to look more like GE and IBM at this point.
Yeah,
like,
well, they're legacy institutions. It's the exact same thing. You know, and they're very, very expensive, very high walls, right? Barriers of entry, all the kinds of things. And if you look at the new kinds of stuff that's happening, there are so many ways in which we can mix and blend and bend and switch our identities and get resources that we need, that we put it together to create our own spiritual, quotation mark, spiritual, religious, ethical lives.
One of the things that I was interested in, and you guys had produced an essay on quantum innovation along with Clay, and one of the things that you guys had put forward is this idea of like certain types of innovations in a technical capacity, they sort of take root more easily, right, if you're trying to decide between one soft drink or another soft drink. But the ones that maybe affect a deeper part of who we are, what are those barriers then? Like what are the identity barriers that we often face in terms of taking on what might potentially be life-changing ideas?
Yeah, well, let's use a slightly different example. For those of you who used to listen to CDs or vinyl, for those that remember.
Vinyl's coming back.
I know, it's very retro. I was just watching a big presentation. It's coming, and these things go in cycles, but I don't think I think of which brand MP3 I'm listening to. No, maybe I get it at Amazon, maybe I get it at, it could be in iTunes, maybe it's Spotify. It doesn't really matter.
You can't do the smell test on
It's
an
not the
MP3.
smell. It's not very, sensory oriented. When you get into things like what kind of car do I drive? A simple example: some people drive a Hyundai or a car that's $5,000-$10,000 to get from A to B. Well, if you're someone who feels you need a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, or a Tesla, the job isn't so much just getting from A to B. It's about who you are. And with that, I hand it back over because he can now sort of
I think we all know intuitively that things that are mere utilities are going to be easier to change. You don't really care what hammer that you use, unless it turns out you have your grandfather's hammer. Then you may care a little bit more in the change. But when we're talking about very large domains that get into how we tick as human beings, so health, education. A lot of the things that when we talk about games for change, when we're trying to change society, change attitude, change values, that's a really serious game. And we have to do it playfully, but don't be surprised that the change is going to be much slower.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, for me, I was at the Wall Street Journal. I worked there for about 5 years, and I think one of the biggest challenges for games in particular is transcending this perception that the future of games is just about new technologies,
right.
but it's also about culture as
right.
well, and that you can create. You've used the example, the Lister example, where disinfecting wounds was something that was known to be scientifically true, but the culture of the day, or Galileo, right, where he can tell everyone that the Earth revolves around the sun all he wants, but if the culture of the day doesn't accept that, I'm curious for you all, like, what kind of barriers to entry do you think that games maybe face? Like, how do you shift people's perception of self, their identity, when you're introducing something new and transformative like games?
I mean, the first thing is what we were talking about earlier, and I never thought of it this way until you mentioned me. Is part of it is just generational. I'm 56. I have a 26-year-old and a 21-year-old, and I'm not somebody who is fluent, quotation marks, as part of my life in the gaming community. My kids are a little bit more, but it's clear that their kids will definitely be. So part of it is just familiarity and a kind of safety and security that comes with that familiarity. The next thing is that it actually speaks deeply to people. It has to speak deeply to people in ways that doesn't create too much anxiety. Just enough anxiety to produce change, but not so much anxiety that produces massive, what we call threshold resistance.
Right. Craig, for you, did you have any of that when you were looking at games for the first time? Because now you've come to games through Games for Change. Did you feel like any generational resistance about what games could ostensibly do?
Well, at what period, though? Early on?
I don't know. I guess maybe early on.
Well, I wasn't a very hardcore gamer growing up, notwithstanding the fact that my father owned the local toy store and we carried Nintendo, Commodore. It was very early on, and it's funny. Something either grabs you or it doesn't grab you. And for some reason, the early, what I would have thought I'd be an early adopter of video games. Took a lot of computer science, relatively speaking, for back in the 1970s. I went to Colgate because they had a mini computer, which probably most people don't even know what a mini computer is, but that was like the reason I went to Colgate.
Is it actually, those are not actually small, are they?
No, they're
actually very big.
It's very big, but it basically decimated. It disrupted the mainframe. IBM actually used to make computers, for those of that.
My father worked for IBM. He
Good.
sold PS1s. So.
Oh, all right. Well,
Yeah.
So, I think it's what's your point of entry? And like I kind of missed, when I was at college doing, programming in Fortran and COBOL and BASIC and Lisp and all these weird, I said, who's ever really going to use a computer? I mean, it's like for data processing and for making reservations. I don't get it. I spent an entire January rotating a cube. That was my entire my Jan plan. I said, So we weren't far enough along on the technology curve to have that immersive, transcendental experience, in quotes, because we can talk a little bit about transcendence.
Do you think if the technology had been there when you were, I don't know, in your teens, 20s, that you would feel differently about games at that time?
I feel differently about the technology. I'm not sure about games particularly.
Yeah.
I was always bad at games. I just always lose. I don't know, had I understood that this was a whole new thing about mastery and, peer collaboration, that's not what it was when you were playing Pong or Donkey Kong. It was like not very exciting.
But some of that reticence is deep-rooted, right? Some of this, we have this anxiety about play, about this like juxtaposition between leisure and kind of work, which
I mean, it's predominantly. I mean, from a sociological perspective, it's predominantly a Protestant problem. I mean, what happens in the modern period is that these things get separated. Play and leisure gets separated from the rest of the important stuff in life, right? As opposed to all one has to do is look at ancient documents and see that probably the earliest form of play was religion itself. I mean, I always say I'm in the ultimate game of play. It's all make-believe religion. I mean, and I mean that respectfully, but it's all make-believe. But if you don't know that it's make-believe, then it becomes very, very dangerous. So, but it's make-believe. It's very immersive. It invites you into stories. I mean, all the things.
We're talking about religion now.
Religion
does those things.
All it is, we're in the next round. It's not nice to say it this way, but we're kind of beginning into a post-religion phase in a place like America. And the next round what will be the designs that actually accomplish very similar sorts of stuff. So I mean, anybody who went to a Passover Seder last week went to a game, okay?
They should market it that way, though.
I know. Well, part of it was
Passover Seder.
First of all,
the game.
Until the late 1600s, none of these things need to be marketed that way because they were the games called life. Now games is here, and life is here, and religion's here, and work's here. And part of, I think, the excitement that the new technologies allow, and at least this next phase, I think, of game design, as best as I understand it, is that we're really integrating. But integrating is very, very complicated, and it will disrupt existing legacy institutions. I mean, if you begin to immerse yourself in what it means to die, I mean, we just heard this amazing thing before, but if you immerse yourself in that, one of the fundamental roles of religion was death management. And here's make-believe. Make-believe.
Death management sounds like something you can major in
Yeah,
school.
no, well, you can.
It's like
It's
I had a minor.
Unfortunately,
minor in death management.
unfortunately, it doesn't work, because you do die. But I mean, at least now. Right. But so the question is, when you can immerse yourself in those kinds of experiences, right? It used to be you had to fast 2 days to have a sense of transcendence. Now, what happens in these immersive kinds of games where you actually will be able to experience transcendence? Okay, so, and it's every one of these experiences. So we're going to shortcut with new technologies a lot of the experiences, quotation marks, that were designed by religion.
Right, right. It seems like religion has a much longer, they have a lot more experience in terms of what transcendence ostensibly is for, right? It's directed at some type of thing, and it seems like games are often creating those types of experiences, but not always thinking through, like, what is this for? What is this ultimately for?
Yeah, I think religion doesn't think about what it's for too much either these days. So, but,
they'll be in good company then.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful game designer. His name's Adam Saltzman, and he did a really incredible talk talking about his philosophy of games, and he kind of brings up this idea. I think he calls them like units till death. So he wants to make games that reflect on. It's really interesting. So people are very unwilling, like infinity as a concept, right? Like most people don't deal with that in their everyday life. But we play games like Temple Run, in a game that you can never win. That little man runs, and he always dies every single time. And people are willing to engage with the infinite in that sort of way. It's interesting to have game designers reflect through their craft on those
part
types of
Part of
big
the
ideas.
problem is, I don't know about in gaming, but I know in religion, as soon as one's too self-conscious inside the religion game, religion becomes either stupid, trivial, exotic, or evil. And so once you begin to walk out of the make-believe, it doesn't work. It's like we're going to play this game, but I'm not going to obey these rules, And no, it doesn't work that way. Everybody decides we're going to make believe.
Right.
And then the make-believe begins to make you believe,
Right.
And begins to have authority over you. And so one of the things is when you become too conscious of what it is you're trying to create, creativity goes away. And so I'm always worried in these kinds of settings, like, yikes, the last time people began to really look at religion seriously in the beginning of the modern period, we destroyed religion, right? Look carefully, but don't look too carefully. Don't become too self-aware as a designer. I mean, become better and better and smarter and wiser, but don't become too self-aware. Trust kind of this intuitive sense of what life is about for you, and a lot of good things will happen. Because the worst thing is to say, I'm going to now create something that ensures that people feel compassionate. I promise you, people won't feel compassionate. They'll be bored. So we have to figure out...
You will feel something if you...
Right, that's a really bad way. I'm going to change the world by... No, it doesn't work that way. Right? First, it has to work for you. But I mean it respectfully. I'm not saying that you shouldn't think. Creativity doesn't work because one's incredibly self-conscious. One gets into the flow of creativity. So when you think of religion when it works, and historically when it worked, whatever work means there, it's because you were in it. You were in the game. The great shamans, the great priests, the great religious poets, the great religious choreographers, they didn't sit down and say, now, how do I make people feel infinity? Or how do I make people know? It came out of who they are to describe an experience that would help other human beings flourish, because it was helping them flourish.
Yeah, I think that's actually been one of the difficult things that games have struggled with, is because they're so technical in nature that the rational side often wins out, because the idea is like, oh, well, we can instill creativity by putting X, Y, and Z systems in place because it works here and there.
Well, you'll find we're working backwards from, okay, so what components are out there? Here's my engine. It's a first-person shooter game. What can I do to make it different? And this is sort of a classic distinction between disruptive innovation and what's referred to as sustaining innovation. So sustaining innovation is taking a first-person shooter game, literally, Call of Duty. And I had some experience with something called Firefighter, which I thought
tell us
was
about
brilliant.
You've worked in games, so
I went one step away, and it didn't end up as the best. But I learned an enormous amount. I love, part of it is being willing to fail. And sometimes it's costly, and sometimes it's just very educational. But people who, if you're at a corporation, a typical corporation as we would think of it, going in and experimenting with a major franchise, say, let me just kind of tweak this around, see if it works. And if it fails, no big deal. I don't think that's the best way to launch one of the new tentpole games coming out.
Well,
but when you're,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the games, speaking of first-person engines, this is a game called Gone Home, which is it uses a first-person mechanic to tell this amazing sort of coming-of-age story. It is cool to see some game designers maybe taking what would traditionally be these sustaining innovations, a first-person game, and trying to do something new and disruptive for it.
Yeah. So, and let's come back to that, because the question is, there's nothing wrong with sustaining innovation. And I'm in a corporation.
Right.
I want a lot of sustaining innovation. Disruptive innovation is something that's going to radically change the world. And so it depends on who you are, or as Irwin taught me, who you are in the drama. If I want to change the world, Steve Jobs wanted to change the world. That was like his vision. We just need to understand what jobs we're trying to get done, because that's the fundamental premise of disruptive innovation.
Right.
And if you don't know what the job is, if, you know, as you say, you know, give me a compassion. I want a compassion. It's not going to be authentic. It's probably not going to be radical. If someone does have this insight, and I've seen, saw quite a few games, I said, wow, this is really different. But how do you think of what we call the non-adjacencies, to take the traditional gaming components and engines and design and look and feel and playability and incorporate it into a radically new experience? That's not so easy to do.
Is there something that you think that games can learn from your work at Tribeca? Do you feel like there's something that you all have done at Tribeca really well that if you could sort of hand this over to other people who might be looking to replicate that kind of success or that kind of impact?
Well, I think my personal feeling is, and we've been, even coming together with Games for Change, some people didn't immediately get it, but I think successful gaming, and I'm moving it away from pure entertainment value with the adrenaline pumping games, is really going to be about incredibly well done storytelling. And a film festival is nothing more than every conceivable different way of telling a story. I didn't see it yet, but Bob De Niro made a 6-second Vine film today, for those of you who are familiar with Vine. Now, people wouldn't traditionally think of Vine as a powerful storytelling thing. Well, we've seen some incredibly interesting applications of Vine. So it's a new way of telling stories. I think the same with video games, and I think particularly, I did get a chance to look at Going Home. I said, wow, this got a lot of storytelling, and who's in control of the narrative, and is it linear, is it non-linear?
Yeah.
And I think the storytelling, if there's anything to be sort of exchanged between the Games for Change sort of traditional approach and what we've been doing, is, wow, how do we merge storytelling, culture, technology, and gaming? And I think that's where the alchemy will occur.
Yeah.
I have almost the same thing. It is fundamentally about storytelling. That's how we move people. We don't move people by saying, now be good, okay? What we do is we immerse a person in a story in which they feel empathic, they feel compassionate, they feel grateful, we feel indebted. You can't get up on no prophet ever succeeded in their own lifetime, because all a prophet does is yell at people for being immoral.
So we should tell,
but it turns out no prophet ever lived in their own time as a prophet.
Which is good. It's good for all the game makers out there. You will not succeed in this life. If you are really a prophet, you will die before success.
You may make profit, but you won't be a prophet.
Because you'll be genuine. In other words, to be genuine and authentic in one's story. Whether one's telling the story, because one's always telling the story that one is in. So think about the great Western tradition stories, or the great religious wisdom, or the wisdom stories. These stories made it they were the first design, right? Think of the people who designed those stories. Those stories were getting at fundamental ways of being human and flourishing. Now, that mode of telling is not going to be working in the next round. So film turned out to be a really important one. Right? A really, really important one in the 20th century. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the 21st century, but it looks like, right, games is going to be a really fundamental, because it's going to integrate wisdom, storytelling, right, and the technology in very, very immersive ways. And play, part of what play is, and we have to, I think if you ask me what should game designers think about, is that trust that play is the fundamental way in which civilization evolves. It's like every morning, don't pray, don't bullshit around with gods you don't believe anymore. But if you really are a serious game designer, get up in the morning and just say, holy shit, or oh my God, which is exactly the same thing, okay? Play evolves civilization. Now go to work, right? And don't let anyone say to you, Be serious, stop playing. It's just the opposite. Be serious, start playing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because what we find is that when people are in their silos, or when you're an expert and you're subject to a different kind of what we call the high-level peer review, you're writing something that everybody in the industry is going to pick apart, you're not going to tend to find a lot of really epic tectonic changes because you're subject to too much potential for failure. When we wrote the paper that you were talking about, our tagline, and this is with Clay Christensen, who is a profound theorist, we took this notion of play really seriously. And our tagline is, it's irreverence, humor, and pop culture, but done in a serious way, not to degrade. I mean, we can talk about it.
And it's an off-white paper.
Yes, we call them the off-white papers for those of you.
So like an eggshell or?
Well, off-color, off-white, it's
hopefully it won't sit on a
gloss or
shelf.
semi-gloss, I guess that's.
Semi-gloss, but nobody, no consumer reads a white paper done by, any of the think tanks out there. So we tried to do something that was a little bit more consumer-facing.
Right.
So one of the things we've been talking about, we spent a lot of time talking about accountability for moral and ethical development, particularly in a world where the demographics are changing quite a bit. We've looked at the statistics about heaven and hell. Those were accountability technologies that aren't really working
We're
all
talking
that
about
well.
great game design. Imagine designing hell and designing heaven in ways that people actually imagined and quotation marks believed and played the game. Right?
Hell, the game, also.
I mean, like,
Well,
yeah, right, exactly.
Dante's Inferno, the game.
There's
Yes.
a building in Buenos Aires that called Palacio Barolo, which is based perfectly on Dante. It was originally designed to be a mausoleum for Dante, and every floor, there's all the floors, and you start at the bottom, and you get to the top. So these things can be built from scratch. I'm sorry, continue.
No, I'm just saying, I think that when we talk about issues like accountability, so one of the great, I don't mean to put it this way, but one of the great imaginings is, this seeing eye that holds you accountable. Now, that's fine as long as it works however it works, but most people don't believe that anymore, even the people that actually claim they do. Okay, so what is going to create? What can we immerse ourselves in? What sorts of experiences / games can we design that create that kind of feel for us?
Yeah. Oh, one of the people you guys have talked about is about the Pope being this concept of like moral innovation. I was wondering if you could talk about that, what that means, and how you sort of apply. Because it seems like there are some, as Nick was pointing, Nick Fortuna was talking about earlier, that games do have the ability to contemplate ethics, to create moralities. And I was wondering, what does this concept of moral innovation sort of mean for you all, especially working within, a traditional system like?
Just one thing about that ethics, it's really important that you cannot get people to be ethical, and you don't become ethical because of principles. No one becomes ethical because they read a principle, okay? People become ethical because they engage in relationships and stories that invite, right, a kind of stretching or a wider moral horizon. So it's not about principles, it's actually about stories and games. The Pope, you can start with the Pope, because a rabbi and a...
Well, it's, the joke is a rabbi, a professor, and an entrepreneur walk into a bar, and that's kind of Irwin's the rabbi, Clay's the professor. I guess that makes me the entrepreneur.
What's the punchline for the joke?
Well, it's a long punchline, which is we ended up three people from completely different domains and walks of life, kind of looking at some of these, pretty deep-rooted questions about who we are as people, how we're going to try and make a better society, which is games for change, and what role can gaming play in that? Yeah. And it's very powerful. But we just announced yesterday that we will present at the Innovation Awards on Friday that one of our major recipients, although he will not be attending, is Pope Francis. And
you can send him a dove, maybe.
Well, we actually give hammers, and
two doves.
Two doves and a hammer. And with a hammer, you can break business models that don't work, or you can build a new cathedral. Yeah. So, but I think he'll probably, I don't know if he's going to send out a tweet, which is thanks for my hammer. No, we were very serious about it.
We call it early moral adopter or disruptive moral innovator.
Right.
In that, if you look what he's done, first of all, he asked a very significant question. We're not making it more than it is, but it's really interesting for someone with that much power to say what is really the job to get done here. You know, if you read, I mean, his most recent writings, you know, the job is joy and justice. Now, whether you can pull it off or not is a separate issue, but to be able to say, here's what this is about. It's not about whether people have abortions, don't have abortions, gay marriage, not gay marriage, these kind of moral, cultural issues to be very judgmental about. That's not the job. The job is to produce enough joy and enough sense of justice that we wind up doing the right thing about those issues. And that's a very significant thing that he's pulled off. So asking the job to get done is really, really big. And then making it accessible and usable. I'm an 8th generation rabbi, and Craig is not a religion person, and he's Jewish. And here we're saying we're non-consumers of Catholicism. And there are many non-consumers of Catholicism right now. And part of the key to disruptive innovation is you actually think about the non-consumers, the non-market. In other words, and I think to be able to conceptualize things that way for a head of institution is very hard, because usually what you want to do is you want to preserve your institution at all costs.
Yeah. Stephen Johnson says that chance favors the connected mind,
yeah,
which
great.
It's always
Great.
resonated with me. It's like
Great.
the more that games can be pulling in from outside areas, from outside arenas, from places that are not games themselves, I think that that's where there's certainly a lot of potential there.
Well, one of the things just in terms of design, I mean, what we're seeing with this Pope is, it's kind of hard to connect the Pope and game design, but we'll try. Why not?
That's a pretty big game.
Yeah.
Dress up.
He's concluded that he needs to redistribute the power away from the centralized cathedral and delegate it out to the bishops, saying we can't opine on everything. When you think about our console cathedrals, I mean, we kind of had our Nintendos, our PlayStations, our Game Boys, but when you have games for change, the whole world is in this new, empowered. You don't have to spend $100 million to change the world. And my guess is those games aren't going to change the world, but something coming out of Games for Change just might.
Well, that's a great way to close this. We're out of time, but please give a hand to Irwin and Craig. Thank you very much.